We are not talking about cougars. We're not talking about bobcats. We're not talking about lynx. But we are talking about wildcats. Wildcat cartridges, that is. Some of mine and the patrons' favorite wildcat cartridges. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way with almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Bios in the show notes. But today it's more of just a fun chat about our favorite wildcats. Now, many wildcats have gone mainstream. That's not what we're talking about. A lot of the cartridges we love today started out as wildcats, and I don't think there's a Merriam-Webster's definition for the cartridge thing we're talking about, but it's somebody looking at an existing cartridge and thinking, I could modify this, tweak this to make it better. I could neck it up, I could neck it down, I could blow out the shoulder, and make this wildcat cartridge. And the way I'm going to define a wildcat is it's not commercially available by a big ammo company. There may be some small boutique companies that load wildcat cartridges or will custom make a cartridge, but I'm talking about mainstream, like the big companies, Federal, Winchester, Remington, like they're not loading for these rounds. Now, that said, the cartridge that sparked this whole idea for an episode came out of the Patreon chat. A lot of stuff going on in there. And it was a cartridge I never heard of. One of the patrons, Pat, said, hey, why don't you talk about this cartridge? And I was like, I know nothing about this cartridge. And apparently on the vast expanses of the internet, not much is known about it. But it's what sparked a conversation and a lively debate in the chat. The 353 Casull. Now, you might be familiar with the 454 Casull, which is probably why they came up with the name the 353 Casull. And as far as I can tell, and it's an enigma wrapped in a riddle, but as far as I can tell, Freedom Arms, which is known for making really, really high-end, top-quality revolvers, stamped this on the chambers of their 357 Magnums to handle hotter pressures. Internet lore says, or I was told, this is just speculation, that up to 60,000 PSI, which is a high for some rifles. If that's true or not, I don't know. I could find no, what I would call credible source for this, meaning not just somebody posted it on a forum on the internet, right? There's probably forums about all kinds of wacky stuff that never happened on the internet. I can't find anything like Hodgdon or a big bullet or powder manufacturer that I would consider credible, reliable source that publishes reload data. I can't find any source on this cartridge. From what I can tell, it's just a hot-loaded 357. Well, lots of people that hand-load hot-load 357. There are some formulas floating around the back corners of the internet with some pretty robust claims about the 353 Casull. And one of the things that came up in the chat, and it depends on the powder you use. Powders that I've commonly used, you can fit way, way more powder in a 357 than it calls for, depending on the powder. One of the guys pointed out he loads H110 and it's pretty much filling the case. But a lot of powder, 700X, a lot of the dots, red dot, blue dot, green dot, long shot, things like these powders, they may not take up as much of the case. The thing is that the 38 Special, I know we're talking about a different cartridge, but stay with me here. The 38 Special is way bigger than it needs to be for modern times. It was developed in a black powder era, and if you're loading it with black powder, yeah, you kind of want to load all that case capacity, but with smokeless powder, you need a little itty-bitty portion of that case. I designed that today, that 38 Special will probably have a case smaller than 9mm, if that blows your mind. Well, the 357 Magnum, it doesn't have to be that long to fit the powder. It has to be that long because they didn't want you to shove it in an old 38 Special, 1800s or early 1900s gun and blow your face off. They made it a little bit longer. Not to fit more powder because they didn't want you to chamber it in a 38 Special. So it has a big, big powder reservoir. If you look at like 700X, you could fit several times the powder that it's called for in that case. You should not do this, but I'm telling you that you can load a 357 Magnum way, way hotter than it calls for until the gun blows up. I know because I've done it and I've destroyed a very nice 357 Magnum. But much like Elmer Keefe did with the 44 Special, you got to know your limitations there. But published data, you can load hotter than that. Now, I don't know that that's always a good philosophy. I've gone through many stages, and I've been shooting since I was very young. I've gone through a lot of stages. Grew up casting lead projectiles when I was probably way too young to be messing with molten lead responsibly, but I was doing it. But there was times when I was really into Magnums. If you can believe this, there was times when I was really into Glocks. Whew, I was so young. But, I think if you get into hand loading, you get into this phase where you're like, I want to load everything super hot. And then now I'm like, maybe not. Maybe if I want to push the envelope, I just go to a bigger cartridge. That said, if you want to push the envelope, the 353 Casull, if it is in fact even a cartridge, I think it's just what they stamped on their barrel designating that it could handle hotter loads. But there is a 357 maximum. That's a thing, and there is the 357-44, which is a thing. There's also pistol data for a 35 Remington. So that was somebody's recommendation on a Wildcat. It's an enigma wrapped in a riddle, shrouded in internet lore and back corners of forums. Let's move on to my favorite Wildcat. I've talked about this, but it's been a long, long time. That was a long time ago. I remember because I was working grave shift when I recorded it outside in the middle of the night, my day off because I was used to graves, working on a tactical team to stop active shooters. It's been a while, but I talked about this then. It's the 6x45. Imagine a world where the 223 5.56 wasn't so marginal, wasn't so anemic. And I like the 5.56 223. I shoot it quite a bit. I compete with it. I've gone to war with it. I've done police work with it. But I would consider it marginal as an intermediate cartridge. Well, the 6x45 is that necked up to 6mm. So instead of a 55, well, you could go all the way down to a 36 grain bullet to a 55, 62. Now they're getting into heavier 77s. But imagine if you could go, from a 55 up to over 100 grains. 100, 103, 107. Well, you could do that with a 6x45 simply by necking it up, and you could even use the same brass. Use the same brass, use the same magazines, use the same bolt. You just need a new barrel. The 6x45. For as much merit as that cartridge has, it doesn't have a lot of love, and I kind of shake my head when I see all these new cartridges coming out, like the 224 Valkyrie and the whatever Arc and Advanced this and Super Magnum Speed and an AR that. It seems to me a more practical choice would be the 6x45. It's still an intermediate cartridge, but I think a lot more, ballistic merit than a 223. Now, people might disagree with that, and that's fine, but I've said before, if I were choosing, I would not have chosen to go back to a full-powered rifle cartridge for a mainline infantry weapon. I think there are people that should, in a rifle squad, maybe even a rifle team, have a full-powered rifle. But I think, by and large, for an infantry weapon, intermediate cartridges, as we learned in World War II, they kind of have a lot of merit. So, the assault rifle concept, and that's best, I think, in an intermediate cartridge. So I've said before, if I were picking, the military's new cartridge, I would probably go with a 6x45. No, I might mess with the case a little bit and blow it out and mess with shoulders or something like that, but a 6x45 is likely what I would go with. Still an intermediate cartridge, same capacity, a little bit more payload in the bullet. I think it's a phenomenal, phenomenal cartridge that really has never caught on, but I think that it should. So that's my pick. Now let's look at some of the patrons' picks. The 5.56x24. Imagine, we talked about making the 5.56 a little bit more powerful, maybe a little bit better ballistically heavier payload. Imagine if you shrunk it, Honey, I Shrunk the 5.56, left it in the dryer too long, and you could fit it in a pistol. Well, that's the 5x24. Now, this round, a Wildcat, there is kind of a mainstream version of this, and this is the 22 TCM. And you might argue that this is kind of describing a 5.7, but without maybe some of the hassle of a 5.7 as far as reloading and things like that. But if you could take a common 9mm pistol and just get with a barrel swap and maybe springs and shoot a high velocity 22 cartridge, that would be this, the 5.56x24. So if that's something that intrigues you and you don't want to go with the 22 TCM or a 5.7, this might be your thing. Oh, and I should mention which one of the patrons came up with that. That would be Matthew. Next, moving on to Evan. He says the 375 H&H Ackley. Now, there's a lot of Ackley cartridges. Ackley, if you don't know, is kind of one of these guys that would look at a existing cartridge and think, how can we, Tim the Toolman Taylor, kind of make it a little bit more powerful on standard cartridges. There's a lot of cartridges of his, or that he improved upon, or Ackley'd. And the most notable of those, which today is not a Wildcat anymore, it's a factory chambering, is the 280 AI, 280 Ackley improved. But Evan says a 375 H&H Ackley improved. Now, 375 is pretty much big enough to kill anything on the planet and probably has killed all the big game on the planet. The big dangerous game in Africa. I don't know that I will want more power than the 375 H&H. But hey, if you do want more power than the 375, you could Ackley it and give it even more power. These are his stats, but he says a 270 grain bullet at 2990 feet per second. And then Evan also has the 6.5x284. Now I'm going to mention it because he's mentioning it, but I'm going to tell you why it probably may not count in a little bit. But the 284, a phenomenal factory cartridge, way ahead of its time, way ahead of the rifle it was chambered in, way ahead of the short magnum craze. But this was a short magnum before short magnums were cool. A very early short efficient magnum cartridge, the 284 Winchester. That's only the beginning of this story. It was, and it is still popular among F-class shooters, but outside of that, not super popular. Well, as happens with many cartridges, somebody thought, let's neck this down. And they necked it down to 6.5. And you get the 6.5 284. It's a good cartridge. It was kind of I would consider like a hipster elk cartridge back before the 6.5 Creedmoor and the 6.5 PRC were kind of popular. I remember this from back in the day. Now, that said, both those cartridges are mainstream cartridges, and they kind of cut to either side of this, so they kind of ate it away. And it's not technically a Wildcat, I believe, because N.R.A loads for it. Now, N.R.A is, maybe it's not Remington or Winchester, but N.R.A is a pretty big ammo company. Not so much in the U.S., but outside of the U.S. Maybe it doesn't count, but it's a cool cartridge. I'm going to mention it. It was his pick, the 6.5x284. Now, the other one he mentions, I'm not really familiar with, the 30x375 Ruger. Now, the 375 Ruger is a cool cartridge in and of itself. I'm a big fan of that cartridge. Ruger, I think wisely, looked at some of these popular African and dangerous game hunting cartridges, and many of these need not a short action, not a standard action, but a super long magnum action to chamber, like a traditional 375 H&H or a 416. And they thought, what if we can get the power of those cartridges in a standard length, meaning like a 30-06 length cartridge? And they pretty much did so with the 375 Ruger, the 416 Ruger. I think these have a pretty decent, following for as new as they are and as niche as they are. They're good cartridges. Well, they're also super powerful. So somebody, I guess, took that and necked it down to 30 caliber. Now, there's a ton of 30 caliber magnums. I'm not a big fan of 30 caliber magnums per se, but this is not my pick, right? This is his pick, a 30x375 Ruger. Now, this is, again, back corners of internet forums, but it seems to be more powerful than the 300 Win Mag. There's a lot of powerful 300 Magnums, but I do like the 375 Ruger case. I think it was well designed, so maybe there's some merit here. I don't plan on getting one of these in the future, but you might. Another thing that I've talked about in the Patreon arena, not so much here, but this is kind of my own idea, and I don't know if it's even warranted or merited, but the Smith & Wesson Governor is a cool revolver, and not because I think, shooting buckshot out of a revolver is the best thing ever, but it's a scandium frame, fairly lightweight, 6-shot 45 Colt. Now, if you just take if you think the whole shotgun thing is a gimmick out of a revolver, let's just put that on the table, right? But Smith & Wesson makes good quality revolvers. This is a scandium frame, so it's going to be light. My problem with a lot of revolvers is a lot of them, when you get outside the J-frame arena, they weigh quite a bit. Well, the Governor doesn't. I want to say it weighs in the 20th some ounces. So it's not super heavy. 6 shots of 45 Colt and a decent modern load is nothing to turn your nose up at. The issue is here that the 410 shotgun shells are quite a bit longer. So you run into the issue of free bore. Free bore meaning the distance that the bullet has to travel before it hits the lands and grooves of the rifling and starts to compress into the forcing cone and the rifling. That's free bore. Now, when you talk about precision rifle and accuracy, generally, some guns may react differently, but generally, you want to get really close to those lands, like really close. Way closer than the amount of free bore that you're talking if you were to shoot 45 Colt out of a Governor. Now, the reason I say it may not be warranted is maybe a Governor, I don't own a Governor, maybe a Governor would be super accurate with just 45 Colt loads anyway. But my thought was, one could, if one were so inclined and knew how to do it safely. I'm not giving you the load data here, but you could take 454 Casull brass, which is quite a bit longer, and perhaps load it down, not load it super hot, but load it down to a decent, respectable 45 Colt load, assuming you had enough volume in the powder to not run into pressure issues the other way with too little powder. But assuming you got around that, if you know what you're doing, why you couldn't load a longer 45 Colt or long Colt load so you didn't have all that free bore if one were so inclined in a Governor, or if you wanted to slum it a little bit in a Judge. Just kidding, Judge fans. But if it's an issue, if you wanted more accuracy, it seems to me that you would eliminate a bunch of variables if you got that bullet closer to the forcing cone. That is something that might be on the table that might be interesting. I'm not the biggest fan. I carry a revolver sometimes, a scandium frame 357, but I'm not the one to tell you that a revolver is usually the best choice in the modern day. But a lot of people do think that, and that's fine. But you could do a lot worse than a lightweight scandium frame 6-shot 45 Colt. And especially if you wanted it more accurate to eliminate that free bore. And, oh, by the way, it also, if you put it back on the table, will shoot 45 ACP and the shot shells if you were so inclined. Just an idea for a Wildcat that I don't know even exists. I don't know if anybody's doing that. Anyway, those are some thoughts on some cool Wildcats from myself and from the Patreon community. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate all that you do. Patreon is a big blessing to me. And even if you aren't sure about Patreon, you can go check it out. And there's a lot of stuff you can see on there for free. A lot of the stuff is for patrons, for paid members, and only they can see it. But there's quite a bit on there that's for free. A lot of the voting and the poll stuff you can vote on. There's a lot of really cool guys over there that I'm blessed to have as part of the community. And you might find that as well. Anyway, should be a Patreon link in the show notes. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate all that you do. Thank you for listening. If you're a regular listener, thank you for staying tuned for, weeks, months, years that, by the grace of God, we've been doing the podcast. I appreciate you guys and have a blessed day.